So today I'm going to be talking about the UK court case of Bell versus Tavistock. This is the court case in the United Kingdom that has made a ruling that children under the age of 16 cannot receive or consent to puberty blockers, even if a medical professional believes it's right for the children. I'm going to be covering this by examining certain key components of the court case and examining certain pieces of medical evidence that I believe show that the court case is wrong. I am neither a doctor nor am I a lawyer. So if you disagree with my conclusions, I will have all my sources in the description below, and you're welcome to formulate your own opinions and perspectives on it. Further, I am going to be quoting the court case verbatim. So if the court uses language, which I personally would not use, to describe gender and gender identity, I apologize. The courts are not always the best in terms of that, but I am going to quote the case verbatim. I personally, however, will be using language to the best of my ability to talk about topics of gender and gender identity that I understand are consistent and accurate. Further, I am going to have to bring up the topic of suicide within my arguments, so if that is something that affects you, just be aware of that. It is an important part of the conversation and argument, especially for the protection of trans people from suicidal thoughts and ideation over the course of their lifetime. With that said, let's jump into the case itself. The argument of the case and what it is essentially trying to look at is whether or not two different age groups, those under the age of 16 and those between 16 and 18, which I guess are seen as different mental health states or mental states for development, are able to consent to puberty blockers. The court acknowledges that in 2011, puberty blockers were only available to those over the age of 16. However, as of 2011, some people between the ages of 12 and 15 were allowed to receive puberty blockers through the early intervention study. And this is actually consistent if you look at the US and the Netherlands, the Dutch, in how they basically viewed the United Kingdom's perspective at this point as kind of backwards. This article states that in each meeting, the Dutch, US, and some UK clinicians were clear that they considered the UK service to be an outlier in not supporting pubertal suppression under 16 years, as had become standard practice in overseas centers. The Dutch clinicians argued that the consequences of non-treatment, i.e. physiological harm, and potential for future self-harm were likely to be greater than those of non-treatment. An ethicist argued strongly that it was in the best interest of the children to offer earlier pubertal suppression, that arguments about irreversibility were spurious, and that if it were impossible to consent to interventions whose outcome is uncertain, much medical research involving human beings would be unethical. There was considerable dissatisfaction by patients with the situation in the United Kingdom, with a number of parents electing to take their children overseas for treatment, particularly to the USA. This was documented at the time. So essentially, both the US and the Dutch physicians, as well as many UK clinicians, ended up coming out and stating that the UK was basically backwards on this, and that this needed to be changed. And given the court's current perspective, I guess that would be even more entrenched, that the courts have now further positioned the United Kingdom as backwards in terms of this decision-making process. The court goes on to argue that one of the issues raised in the proceedings is the non-existent or poor evidence base, as it is said to be, for the efficacy of such treatment for children and young persons with gender dysphoria. Basically, they are arguing that there's really no good reason and poor evidence to show a good reason for children to receive this. However, the US has argued in its court case, in its medical documents, that the main idea behind the suppression of endogenous puberty was to decrease distress by preventing the development of non-congruent secondary sexual characteristics. This essentially means that there is a good reason, a physical reason, for children not to be denied puberty blockers. So there is a reason for the treatment. The court case goes on to state that a certain doctor, Professor Scott, director of the University College London Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, has made the argument that children under 18 make less rational decisions, and therefore, given the risk of puberty blocking treatment and the fact that these have irreversible effects, the children are unable to make a rational decision when it comes to this. However, US research seems to indicate that, or other forms of research seem to indicate, like the Dutch study, that authors conclude that treatments were fully reversible, and it's one of its main advantages. Further, according to most studies and of the Endocrine Society guidelines, most adolescents develop the capacity by the age of 16 to start hormonal therapy. Not puberty blockers, but actual hormonal therapy at the age of 16, meaning that puberty blockers would have had to have been assessed well before then in order for the required and desired results to come about. So if children are perceived at the age of 16 to be able to take hormone therapy, such as estrogen or testosterone, to confirm gender identity, puberty blockers should be reasonably able to be given earlier, given that they don't have any long-term effects. And studies have shown this, despite the opinion of this particular physician. The early intervention study ends up backing that claim and has a piece that was recognized by the court that says if you decide to start hormone blockers early, your physical development will return as usual in your natal gender, your gender assigned at birth, right? Again, the courts are not providing the best language for all this. As far as we are aware, the hormone blockers will not harm your physical or psychological development. And that's backed, again, by the Dutch and US studies. And I don't have the ability to read the Dutch language, so I am going to have to rely mostly on the stuff in English because, unfortunately, I don't have access to that particular component. But if you have any translations of that, please feel free to leave that information in the description. I would love to read it just for my own knowledge. So the plaintiff in the case makes the claim that when she was 15 years old, that she was referred to this particular service and that the local children and adolescent mental health services clinic had stated that through the psychiatrist that gender was a spectrum and persuaded her not to pursue medical transition at that time. She, however, took this as a challenge as to how serious she was and that what her feelings were and made her want to transition more. Furthermore, she did not take puberty blockers until the age of 16. So what this has to do with the bearing of this particular case, where we're arguing about children under the age of 16, seems to be irrelevant and seems to not make much sense as a position. Furthermore, she ended up taking testosterone at 17 and then decided after the fact, after 3 years, 2 of which are clearly in adulthood, she began to have some doubt about her desire to take testosterone further. So most of this was done well within the age that's recognized by doctors and medical professionals. And, because we determined that people over the age of 16 can take hormone therapy based on medical consensus. And she was within that framework to do so. And then decides as an adult to stop pursuing testosterone as part of her transition process and ends up reclaiming she as her gender identity, using she, her pronouns, and identifying as a woman. I don't see what bearing her particular case has to do with any of the decision for children under the age of 16 to consent to puberty blockers. I don't understand what relevance any of this has to do with the argument that the court is looking for, especially because her position is all backed by medical professionals, And it is a shame that in her particular case, that transition didn't end up being what she wanted or needed. But I don't know what bearing that has to do with consent, because she clearly consented to everything that was provided for her. And I don't think that this one case precludes the numerous amount of research that's been done to show that trans people benefit from this particular set of circumstances of taking hormone blockers and then pursuing hormone therapy afterward. I guess I just don't see what the argument is that she is making. You know, most of this was done while she was a consenting adult, and certainly within the consenting range accepted by medical professionals. This is countered, and the court acknowledges that this is countered by a 18-year-old trans woman who was prescribed puberty blockers when she was 17 and said that the treatment of hormone blockers may very well have saved her life. In the period of my life that I was prescribed them, my mental health was spiraling due to my dysphoria, and this was impacting on my daily life, learning, and social interactions. I had to shave less, and I didn't have to fear pubertal development anymore. I had the necessary time to think and about my situation and decide on further courses of action. So this again asserts that there are cases, very well documented cases, where puberty blockers allowed a person to make a rational decision ahead of time, at a later date, to determine whether or not this is something they wanted. So I believe that this affirms that this is a good case in many cases. The other claimant in this case is one that frustrates me to no end. There is a Mrs. A mother of a 15-year-old girl with ASD, which, as far as I understand, is autism spectrum disorder. The child has a mental health and behavioral problem. I'm going to refer to this child using they and referring to them as child rather than girl and she, even though the court case does make that claim, specifically because if this child was pursuing any sort of gender treatment, I cannot make an assertion onto their identity, and this is clearly a parent who is probably denying some aspect of their child's identity, and so I'm going to try to be as fair as possible to this child in reading this particular case. The frustrating component for me with this is, one, because the mother does not consent, the unfortunate reality is that this child would not meet the criteria for receiving puberty blockers in the first place, and therefore this is all theoretical, and again, has no relevance on the majority of people going through with this. Secondly, I am frustrated because the child having autism should not have bearing on whether or not the child gets care for their transness, and this mother reads as a TERF, trying to deny their trans child the ability to receive puberty blockers and proper care. And it actually, I personally believe that this should go in the exact opposite direction, where this should actually run in the direction of being child abuse. But unfortunately, that's not the hill we're standing on today. So again, now you have these two claimants, and neither one of them seem to have any validity in terms of their arguments, as far as I'm concerned, for the argument that's being presented, both based on medical evidence and the actual case being decided here. And again, it's just really frustrating because there's a weird mix between autism and mental health and behavioral issues and transness that's being addressed here that is just completely ignoring the experience and needs of the child and asserting the parents' frustration with all of this. And again, the parents' voice is being heard and the child's not. And it just gets me angry. And I can't speak to this particular case. I'm sure there's people who can speak on this way better than I can. But I know there's a lot of issues around this, about the denial of transness around other perceived mental health issues. So what is the conclusion of the case? Well, firstly, the court determines there is real uncertainty over the short and long-term consequences of the treatment of puberty blockers, with very limited evidence as to its efficacy or indeed quite what is seeking to achieve. Well, I already determined what it's seeking to achieve, the removal of secondary sex characteristics that will have a long-term mental health effect on children as they transition when they reach, late adolescence or adulthood. This means, in our view, that because it's also an experimental treatment, that it needs to have more proof to it. Secondly, there is a lack of clarity over the purpose of the treatment, in particular whether it provides a, quote, pause to think in a, quote, hormonal neutral state, or it is a treatment to limit the effects of puberty, and thus the need for greater surgical and chemical intervention later, as referred to in the Health Research Authority report. This argument makes no sense to me. It's literally stated and cited as being a reason for this, as that people need time to think, and that you're taking into account that a child under the age of 16 may not be able to make the full rational decision for this, but can make it at 16 or older after they've had a time to think about it and pursue further discussions with therapists and their parents, assuming, of course, the parents are good in this case and are supporting the child, and it is providing a relatively hormone-neutral state. So, and it's reversible. So what is the problem here? The court is denying a lot of that evidence. Thirdly, the consequences of the treatment are highly complex and potentially lifelong and life-changing in the most fundamental way imaginable. The treatment goes to the heart of an individual's identity and is thus quite possibly unique in medical treatment. So they are now making the claim, despite other claims, that it has long-term effects. And further goes on to argue that the condition being treated, gender dysphoria, has no physical manifestation. In contrast, the treatment provided for that condition does have direct physical consequences. The problem with this is that gender dysphoria has significant mental health consequences. So, claiming that the need has to be a physical manifestation rather than a mental health one prioritizes physical distress over mental distress, which is a problem. Mental health is a real issue and it needs to be addressed. And gender dysphoria is an issue that affects people's mental health. It causes depression. It causes potential thoughts of suicide. It causes a lot of long-term problems if it is not addressed. So saying that it just doesn't have a direct physical manifestation is already a problem. Further, when we look at the actual side effects of these particular treatments, these hormone blockers, common side effects of the GnRH agonists and the antagonists include symptoms of hypogonadism, such as hot flashes, gynecomastia. Okay, I can't pronounce that. Forgive me. Fatigue, weight gain, fluid retention, erectile dysfunction, and decreased libido. Long-term therapy can result in metabolic abnormalities, weight gain, worsening of diabetes, and osteoporosis. There's also evidence to show that it might have some effects on fertility depending on when it is given and administered to the person who is prepubescent or in certain stages of puberty. That's the one that's not listed here, and that's the one that the court case is going to fixate on, and we will get to that. But the only one that's really an issue here that is kind of permanent is the potential for osteoporosis. But I have a a medical document, going between court case and medical document. I have a medical document that actually cites and states that in children, they can receive the same kind of treatment that any person with bone density issues would get, add back therapy, which will assist in recovering any damage done through osteoporosis and the spine. In summary, the use of northaridone acetate as a add-back therapy in adolescents treated with GnRH agonist for endometriosis appears promising for the preservation of skeletal health. There you go. One of the most common issues, osteoporosis, is already being examined to come up with a treatment for, and therefore there is no real risk long-term of having that in play. The actual risk, though, is suicidal ideation. Within this particular study, which is the main one that I'm going to be focusing on through this, the results are that of 20,619 survey respondents, 18 to 36 years of age, 3,494 reported that they would have wanted pubertal suppression. Of those that did want pubertal suppression, only 89 had actually received treatment. The study further goes on to say that after controlling for demographic variables, pubertal suppression was associated with decreased odds of lifetime suicidal ideation. Further, when split between two different age groups, that of between 18 and 22 and 23 to 36, the younger age group actually had increased odds both of wanting pubertal suppression and of receiving pubertal suppression. Basically, because it's a much more recent treatment, younger people have access to it more than older people. Further, younger people want it because it's more known and available than those who are older. Approximately 9 of 10 transgender adults who wanted pubertal suppression but did not receive it endorsed lifetime suicidal ideation in the current study. That is significant. That is almost 90% of transgender adults who wanted pubertal suppression and not receiving it dealt with lifetime suicidal ideation. But tell me how that's not a physical manifestation, how that's not enough for the courts. That has long-term effects on people. Furthermore, only 4.7% of 18-year-olds who wanted the treatment reported receiving it. And there's other issues that go into this that I just want to point out and highlight. Specifically, the access to pubertal suppression was associated with a greater total household income. Basically, if you're wealthier, you get more access to it. So poor people, who also have a greater risk of suicide, are not getting access to it. Without insurance, the annual cost of these therapies can actually range between $4,000 and $25,000 US. That is significant. So people who are already at risk for suicide now have additional factors of suicide. And again, this study is looking at this, but we're not even able to count the number of people who would have wanted this sort of suppression, these puberty blockers, who did actually commit suicide. Those people are an uncounted statistic. You can't ask them, they're not here. Further, participants who endorsed a heterosexual sexual orientation were more likely to receive pubertal suppression. That's another issue that we should really examine. The perception that those who are homosexual or pansexual or any other sexuality besides heterosexual are not being allowed, in many cases, to receive puberty blockers because heterosexuality is defined as normal. That's a huge problem. Furthermore, family support was also associated with receiving pubertal suppression among those who wanted the treatment. Well, again, if you're not getting your family support and family consent is required for a person underage to get it, it kind of is a huge factor, isn't it? So, the conclusion of these documents is that among transgender adults in the United States who wanted pubertal suppression, access to this treatment is associated with lower odds of lifetime suicidal ideation, and this study strengthens recommendations of the Endocrine Society and WPATH for treatment to be made available for transgender adolescents who want it. How much clearer can you make that? It is a good thing for pubertal suppressions, these puberty blockers, to be put into play because it decreases mental health issues long-term in people by helping to create congruence between physical appearance of perceived gender identity in people and their lived experience. That is a good thing. There is a great deal of potential physical harm in this. Whether or not people commit suicide or not, suicidal ideation leads to self-harm and can lead, of course, to suicide. And you can't really ask the people who died from this perspective whether or not this was important. Getting back to the case and trying not to lose my cool in this moment of anger I'm having. The court talks about how the defendant argues that puberty blockers give the child time to think, but then argues that the court argues that it is not a neutral process. As a minimum, it seems to us that this means that the child is not undergoing the physical and consequential psychological changes which would contribute to the understanding of a person's identity. Basically, the argument here is essentializing cisness. If you are not going through any sort of puberty, you are not in the sound mind and psychological development to determine your identity and therefore cannot pursue getting any sort of, or making any sort of decision on your gender identity. For real? For real. So you have to be subjected to essentially a torturous experience of going through a puberty that is not congruent with your identity in order to somehow prove to the court, prioritizing cisness. If you hear something outside, sorry. There are people in the other apartments. Essentially, this prioritizes cisness, right? This prioritizes the experience of people who are cis as being normalized by claiming that you are not allowed to make the decision until you've gone through proper puberty. Proper puberty. This is wrong. Clearly, this is wrong. Furthermore, the court goes on to say this may confirm the child's chosen gender identity at the time they begin to use puberty blockers, and to that extent confirm their gender dysphoria and increase the likelihood of some children moving on to cross-sex hormones. Indeed, the statistical correlation between the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones supports the case that it is inappropriate to view puberty blockers as a stepping stone to cross-sex hormones. Essentially, there's a bizarre understanding of causality going on here. The court is arguing that puberty blockers actually inform the use of hormone therapy, as opposed to the actual understanding that any medical professional has put forward, that it is an intervention step, that it is an intermediary step to help create rational decisions to enter into having hormone therapy. The great majority of people who have taken puberty blockers are people who would have reached the conclusion that they would take hormone treatments in the future. But by providing the puberty blockers, they are given the ability to do so, one, with more neutrality and more rational thought process, and two, without having to deal with adverse effects that could lead to suicide or suicidal ideation later in life. But no, we're just going to say that these studies actually say that puberty blockers lead to hormone treatments. That one funnels into the other. And that is simply not the case. This is a complete misrepresentation of causality by the court. And the most egregious argument in all of this is that the court asserts that some children and young people who have been treated at this institute say that in their witness statements that they thought sex disgusted them or that they did not think about fertility. Further, the court asserts there is no age-appropriate way to explain to many of these children what losing their fertility or full sexual function may mean for them in later years. I'm just going to say this right now. You are prioritizing the possible desire for a child to have sex over and have children in the future over their desire to not have suicidal thoughts in the future. Their mental health is being put at risk for some imagined reality where the child might want to grow up and have children. Are you serious? Adoption exists. People can still have children well into their adult years. even if they transition. Furthermore, a lot of people who are transgender don't want to go through something like that because it has issues in terms of the congruence of their gender identity. This is prioritizing heteronormativity throughout this. It is prioritizing being cisgender, and it is prioritizing societal norms of having children over the needs and lived experiences of trans people who overwhelmingly have perceived and desired to get these sorts of treatments in order to secure their livelihood and not have to deal with suicidal ideation in the future. You are dealing with a life as it is right now, and are not allowing medical professionals in this court case to make the best decision for the mental health of a person over the perceived desire in the future, sometime in the future, for them to have offspring. Really? Again, adoption exists. This perspective makes no sense to me. None whatsoever. Deal with the issue the child is experiencing here and now. Deal with their lived reality now. Because there also might not be a tomorrow for some of these kids. And again, why are we promoting the life of some future fetus over the understanding of a child for their own mental health? The final conclusion, of course, of the court is that children under 16 cannot make the decision by themselves, and that people over the age of 16, that some clinicians might require the authorization of the court in order to commence clinical treatment. None of these perspectives make any sense to me. These are medically necessary treatments that prevent suicidal thoughts, that help assist trans children with their mental health, that provide an experience where they can make a decision from a gender neutral position, where they do not have the pressure of consistent puberty making their decision faster. It is a general benefit for puberty blockers to be in play from every understanding that I have. And this court is making really terrible decisions. And I hope that whatever system the UK has to overturn said decision comes about very quickly. Because children in the UK are going to suffer immensely for this, to prioritize cis experiences over trans experiences, and normalizing the idea of having a child over mental health care. There's no serious risks. There's no serious long-term risks that exist here that speak to anything about a child not getting this. And to be perfectly blunt, we would allow a child at this age, with the consent of their parents, to make medical decisions about nearly anything else. If a child had diabetes, if a child had high blood pressure and required medication, if the child needed insulin, we wouldn't say, oh, well, what are the long-term effects of insulin on the child? We would give the child insulin so they didn't die. But because it's a mental health issue and mental health is not taken seriously, and I'm not saying that transness is a mental health issue, I'm saying that the gender dysphoria and the effects of gender dysphoria, specifically, are a mental health issue. And it's being denied in favor of some perceived future risk that isn't even understood as what the child wants or needs in the future. Deal with the problem today and address those needs. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notification. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. Love to have you there. We have a great community. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.